The gas lamps in the New Orleans establishment cast long, wavering shadows, making the already dim room feel heavier. Reverend Elijah Vance sat across a small, scarred wooden table from Mr. Silas Thorne. The air was thick with the smell of stale pipe smoke and something vaguely sweet like spilled rum. Thorne, a man whose expensive suit seemed a little too tight, had just leaned forward, a sneer twisting his lips. "Reverend," Thorne began, his voice a low, grating rumble, "your little mission, your humanitarian efforts for these people you champion, it's a fool's errand. They're not ready for your sermons nor your charity. They're a lost cause, Vance. Always have been, always will be." His words, laced with disdain, hit Vance like a cold, wet cloth. Thorne spoke of Vance's faith and his tireless work with the recently freed, enslaved population as if they were a child's game. Vance, a man whose face usually reflected a quiet warmth, remained perfectly still. His hands, clasped loosely on the table, did not twitch. His gaze, however, held a strange, unwavering intensity. It wasn't anger that filled his eyes, not exactly. It was something deeper, a calculated resolve that seemed to cut through the smoky haze between them. He took a slow, measured breath, the kind a man takes before speaking words he knows will carry weight. "Some truths, Mr. Thorne," Vance said, his voice calm, almost unnervingly so, "reveal themselves in the most inconvenient ways." Thorne scoffed, a short, dismissive sound. He started to wave a hand, perhaps to signal for another drink, but then a frantic whisper cut through the general hum of the room. A nervous young man dressed in a slightly rumpled suit rushed to Thorne's side, bending low to speak into his ear. Thorne's face, usually set in a mask of smug assurance, began to pale. His eyes, fixed on the young man, widened almost imperceptibly. The young man's words were too soft to be heard clearly, but the urgency in his tone was undeniable. He mentioned something about a shipment, a bank, and a sudden, unexpected problem. Thorne's hand, which had been reaching for his glass, froze in mid-air. The full extent of Thorne's misfortune wasn't clear, but the sudden shift in his demeanor, the way his jaw tightened, spoke volumes. A sense of impending justice, a quiet, almost poetic retribution, seemed to settle in the humid New Orleans night. It hung around Thorne like a growing shadow. Even as the young man continued to whisper frantically, Vance watched this small drama unfold, his expression unchanged. He didn't gloat, didn't offer a sarcastic remark. He simply observed. After a moment, he slowly pushed his chair back, the legs scraping faintly on the wooden floor. He rose to his full height, a tall, imposing figure even in the dim light. He looked down at Thorne, who was now ignoring him, completely absorbed in the whispered crisis. Without another word, Vance turned and walked away, leaving Thorne bewildered and unsettled. The businessman looked up just as Vance reached the door, a flicker of uneasy recognition in his eyes. But Vance was already gone, leaving behind only the lingering promise of a reckoning that had just begun. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Reverend Elijah Vance wasn't always the composed figure seen in that dimly lit New Orleans establishment. He arrived in the bustling city of New Orleans in 1871, a place still finding its footing after the devastating Civil War. It was a city of stark contrasts, a vibrant mix of cultures and languages, but also a place where deep inequalities ran through every street. For Vance, coming from a quiet, rural town in New England, New Orleans was a shock to his system. His past was rooted in a strong, simple faith. He grew up in a small community where the church was the center of life, and moral principles were taught from a young age. His family, earnest and hard-working, instilled in him a profound sense of justice and a duty to help those less fortunate. He had always been an idealist, believing in the inherent good of people and the power of faith to uplift even the most broken spirits. These beliefs were the bedrock of his life, shaping his worldview and guiding his every decision. But New Orleans was far from the serene landscapes of New England. The city, though beautiful, was raw and unforgiving. The scars of war were everywhere, not just in damaged buildings but in the faces of the people. Vance's idealism, though strong, often clashed with the harsh realities he encountered daily. He saw widespread poverty, sanitation issues, and the simmering racial tensions that had only been exacerbated by the recent emancipation. The newly freed enslaved people, many of whom had nowhere to go and no resources, faced immense struggles. They were free, yes, but freedom without support often meant a different kind of bondage. Vance's dream was clear: to establish a community outreach program, a place where these people could find not just food and shelter, but education, job training, and a sense of dignity. He envisioned a space where children could learn to read, where families could receive medical care, and where everyone, regardless of their past, could hope for a better future. It was an ambitious plan, especially in a city where resources were scarce and prejudice was rampant. The socio-economic climate of New Orleans in 1871 was complex. The city's economy was slowly recovering, but the benefits weren't shared equally. The black community, despite their newfound freedom, faced systemic discrimination, limited opportunities, and constant threats. They were often relegated to the lowest-paying jobs, living in overcrowded conditions, and denied basic civic rights. Racial tensions were a constant undercurrent, occasionally boiling over into open conflict. It was in this environment that Vance first encountered Mr. Silas Thorne. Thorne was a prominent and influential figure in New Orleans, a man of considerable wealth and social standing. He owned several businesses, had connections in local government, and was known for his shrewd dealings. When Vance first arrived, full of hope and passion, Thorne appeared to be a potential benefactor. He seemed to possess the power and resources to make Vance's dreams a reality. Vance, perhaps a little naive in the ways of big city politics and power, saw Thorne as a potential ally, a man who could help him navigate the complex landscape of New Orleans and secure the funding needed for his community programs. Thorne, with his smooth words and promises of support, initially welcomed Vance. He spoke of civic duty and the importance of rebuilding the city. He even attended some of Vance's early sermons, nodding approvingly at the pastor's words. Vance, eager for any help he could get, was initially optimistic. He believed Thorne shared his vision, at least in part. This initial impression, however, was a carefully constructed facade, setting the stage for the deep-seated conflict that would eventually erupt between the idealistic pastor and the cynical businessman. Vance had yet to learn the true cost of Thorne's generosity and the real nature of the man behind the influential name. The cracks in their relationship, subtle at first, began to show soon after Vance's arrival. Thorne's promises of support for Vance's community initiatives, which had initially sounded so firm, slowly started to unravel. Meetings were postponed, then canceled. Funding that was supposedly earmarked for the outreach program never materialized. Thorne would offer vague excuses, blaming unforeseen market shifts or sudden business demands, always with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Vance, still holding on to his idealism, tried to understand, tried to give Thorne the benefit of the doubt. He wanted to believe in the man's good intentions despite the growing evidence to the contrary. Then came the veiled humiliations. In public gatherings, often at charity events or civic meetings where Vance hoped to gain support, Thorne would subtly undermine him. He would introduce Vance with a backhanded compliment, praising his passion but hinting at his lack of practical experience in the real world of New Orleans. Thorne would steer conversations away from Vance's core mission, redirecting them to less urgent, more superficial concerns. He'd make light of Vance's efforts to help the freedmen, suggesting their problems were too complex for simple charity, implying Vance was naive. These weren't outright attacks, but rather carefully placed barbs that chipped away at Vance's credibility, making him seem less capable, less serious. Vance felt the sting, but still he held his tongue, believing that a direct confrontation would only alienate a man whose influence he desperately needed. What became clear over time was Thorne's manipulative nature. He wasn't just withholding support, he was actively trying to steer Vance's efforts toward his own financial gain. Thorne would suggest that Vance's programs could, for example, train workers for Thorne's own factories, but at wages far below market rate, effectively using Vance's goodwill to secure cheap labor. He proposed that Vance's community center could be built on land Thorne owned at an inflated price, of course. Thorne presented these ideas as acts of generosity, as ways to partner and maximize efficiency, but Vance slowly started to see through the thinly veiled attempts to profit from the very people he was trying to uplift. Vance began to witness Thorne's true character in other ways too, instances of injustice that were specific to the social dynamics of 1871 New Orleans. He saw Thorne evicting struggling families from their homes without warning, families who had worked on Thorne's properties for generations. simply because a more profitable tenant appeared. Vance heard stories of Thorne lending money at exorbitant interest rates to desperate small business owners, only to seize their assets when they inevitably defaulted. Thorne used his power and influence to benefit himself at the expense of others, always maintaining a thin facade of respectability, often donating small sums to visible charities while orchestrating much larger exploitations behind the scenes. These actions, though not directly aimed at Vance, weighed heavily on him. He saw the suffering, the desperation, and the systemic prejudice Thorne embodied. The initial act of disrespect, the dismissive comment Thorne made in the dimly lit establishment, was not an isolated incident. It was not a sudden outburst. It was the culmination of years of emotional and ethical erosion, a final insult after a long series of transgressions that Vance had witnessed and endured. Thorne's disdain for Vance's mission wasn't just personal. It was a reflection of his contempt for the vulnerable, for justice, and for anything that stood in the way of his own relentless pursuit of wealth and power. Vance knew, deep down, that his initial optimism about Thorne had been a grave mistake. The emotional atmosphere in Vance's life grew heavier with each passing day. It was like a constant, low-grade fever that never quite broke. The initial discomfort of Thorne's subtle manipulations had morphed into a suffocating pressure. Thorne's opposition to Vance's growing influence, even among the struggling communities, became more direct, more aggressive. It wasn't just about money or veiled insults anymore. It was about outright control, about stopping Vance's work entirely. Conflict started erupting over the simplest things. Vance had found a small, run-down building he hoped to turn into a community center, a place for schooling and basic medical aid. He began to secure the necessary permits, only to find himself constantly blocked. Thorne, through his connections on the city council, would suddenly raise obscure zoning issues or demand impossible building code adherence. Every step Vance took forward felt like 2 steps back, caught in a bureaucratic tangle designed to exhaust him. These property disputes weren't just about land, they were about denying the community a space, about stifling hope. Public debates, which Vance had initially approached with a spirit of open discussion and persuasion, turned acrimonious. Thorne would use his platform, often in local newspapers he influenced, to paint Vance as a naive do-gooder whose efforts were misguided and potentially dangerous to the established order. He'd twist Vance's words, making his calls for equality sound like radical demands, his pleas for compassion sound like a threat to prosperity. These weren't debates. They were smear campaigns designed to isolate Vance and discredit his mission. The social pressures from Thorne's influential circle also mounted against Vance. Invitations to social gatherings once extended out of courtesy dried up. People who had once greeted Vance warmly on the street now averted their eyes or offered curt nods. Some of Vance's former acquaintances, who were beholden to Thorne's business interests, started openly criticizing him, repeating Thorne's carefully crafted narratives. They would say things like, "Pastor Vance means well, but he just doesn't understand how things work here," or "He's stirring up trouble where there doesn't need to be any." Thorne's behavior grew more openly hostile. He stopped pretending to be a benefactor. He would send his associates to disrupt Vance's small community meetings, asking loaded questions, spreading rumors, and generally creating an atmosphere of distrust. He even directly threatened Vance's reputation, hinting that he could dig up old fabricated stories to ruin Vance's standing in the community and among his church members. The veiled threats were clear: stop or face the consequences. This period was the peak of emotional suffocation for Vance. He felt the heavy weight of judgment from certain segments of the community. Many neighbors who had once admired his dedication now looked at him with suspicion. A few church members, swayed by Thorne's persistent narratives, began to question Vance's leadership, whispering doubts about his methods and his focus. Vance found himself increasingly isolated, his idealism battered by the relentless onslaught. He would spend sleepless nights wrestling with his conscience, wondering if he was doing more harm than good, if his stubbornness was endangering the very people he sought to protect. The weight of responsibility felt immense, almost unbearable. He was pushing himself to the brink, feeling the erosion of his spirit, the exhaustion setting in. Every decision, every interaction was fraught with tension. He knew something had to give, but he wasn't sure what or how. This constant pressure, this feeling of being trapped, pushed him to a point where he felt he was running out of options. desperately needing a turning point, a new direction. He prayed for guidance, for a sign, for anything that could cut through the oppressive cloud that Thorne had cast over his life and work. The pressure on Vance had become too much. One sweltering afternoon, feeling completely drained after another frustrating encounter where Thorne's men had successfully turned a group of potential donors against his community center, Vance decided to step away from his usual haunts. He needed a moment of peace, a place where the air wasn't thick with Thorne's influence. He found himself wandering into a bustling eatery he hadn't visited before, a place filled with the sounds of clattering dishes and lively chatter. He took a seat at a small, unassuming table in the corner, hoping to blend in. A young waitress approached his table, a woman named Marie. She had kind eyes, a tired but gentle smile, and a quiet efficiency about her. She placed a glass of water before him, her movements practiced and smooth. Vance ordered a simple coffee, finding a small comfort in the mundane act. As she returned with his order, she noticed the deep lines of worry etched around his eyes, a look she probably saw often in the weary faces of New Orleans' working class. "Troubles weigh heavy on you, Reverend," she said softly, her voice low enough not to draw attention, yet clear enough for him to hear. It wasn't a question, but an observation, made with a surprising lack of judgment. Vance, usually guarded, found himself responding. He spoke not of Thorne's specific machinations, but of the general struggle, the fight for justice in a city that often seemed indifferent. Marie listened, nodding occasionally, her gaze steady and understanding. When he finished, a silence hung between them, not awkward but contemplative. Then Marie spoke, her voice even softer now, almost a whisper. "I know Mr. Thorne," she began, and Vance felt a sudden jolt. Not like most folks know him, as the big man in town. "I knew his father, too, and his mother." Vance waited, his coffee growing cold, a strange sense of anticipation building in his chest. "My mama worked for the Thorne family for years," Marie continued, her eyes distant as if looking into the past. "Before the war and after, she saw a lot, heard a lot, things they thought nobody paid attention to." She paused, taking a deep breath. "Mr. Thorne, Silas, he wasn't always so rich. His father was a gambler, and not a very good one, lost most of what little land they had. They were close to ruin, even had to sell off some of their house servants just to keep a roof over their heads." Vance listened intently, the pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed slowly starting to form. "Then, one night," Marie went on, her voice barely audible, "Silas's father, he won big, bigger than anyone thought possible, and he kept winning. Suddenly, the Thorne family was back on top, buying more land, more businesses. Everyone said it was a miracle, a stroke of luck." Marie leaned in slightly, her eyes meeting Vance's. "But my mama, she saw something else. She saw a young man then, who worked for the Thorne family, a man named Thomas. Thomas was a brilliant man, quiet but smart as a whip. He knew numbers, understood the market better than anyone. He was the one who was feeding Silas's father information, tips for the games, advice on investments. Thomas, he was a numbers man, you could say. Thomas was a free man, but he was indebted to the Thornes. He had a sister, and she was sick, needed medicine, needed a doctor. The Thornes paid for it, but in return, Thomas had to help them. He did, and he was good at it. Too good. After Silas's father died, Silas took over, and he kept Thomas on, but not as a paid employee. He kept him indebted. For years, Thomas was the real brains behind a lot of Thorne's early deals, the ones that made him so powerful. But Silas, he always took the credit and the money. Thomas never saw a dime of the real profits. He just worked, hoping one day he could be truly free, truly clear of the debt. Marie's voice dropped to a whisper. Thomas tried to leave once, told Silas he had paid his debt. Silas laughed, said he owed him more, always more. And then Thomas disappeared. No one ever saw him again. My mama, she always believed Silas. Well, that he made sure Thomas couldn't tell his story. The weight of Marie's words settled over Vance, cold and heavy. This wasn't just about a man's pride or greed. This was theft, exploitation, and possibly something far darker. It was a truth that connected Thorne's wealth directly to the very injustice Vance was fighting against, built on the back of a vulnerable man. Marie's quiet conviction, the pain in her eyes, left no doubt. This encounter was the breaking point. The cycle of suffering Vance realized could finally be broken. The revelation hit Vance like a physical blow, leaving him momentarily breathless. The bustling sounds of the eatery faded into a dull hum as Marie's words echoed in his mind. Shock morphed into a slow, burning anger. Not just anger at Thorn, but a deep, unsettling sadness for Thomas, for Marie's mother, and for countless others who had been exploited by men like Thorn. A cold dread also started to creep in, a fear for Marie's safety. She had just laid bare a secret that could destroy Thorn, and Thorn was not a man to suffer exposure lightly. Vance looked at Marie, her face still etched with the pain of the past, and he saw the immense courage it had taken for her to share such a story. He knew with absolute certainty that he could not let this truth remain buried. The ethical implications were clear. Thorn's wealth, his entire public persona, was built on a foundation of deceit and human suffering. Using this information wasn't about revenge, it was about justice, about exposing the rot beneath the polished surface of New Orleans society. He paid for their coffees, his hand trembling slightly as he placed the money on the table. Outside, the humid New Orleans air felt heavier, the vibrant street sounds now carrying a sinister undertone. He walked Marie back to the edge of the French Quarter, ensuring she was safe to return to her lodging. He made her promise to be careful, to tell no one else what she had told him, at least not yet. Her safety was paramount. As Vance began to process the enormity of what he had learned, the world around him seemed to sharpen, to reveal hidden layers. He started to see the faces of people differently. He thought of Reverend Johnson, a fellow pastor he had met shortly after arriving, a man who had always seemed to hold Thorn in high regard, praising his philanthropy. Vance wondered if Johnson's admiration was genuine or if he too was simply blinded by Thorn's carefully constructed image. Then there was Mrs. Dubois, a kind elderly woman from his small congregation who often brought him homemade bread. She had once mentioned Thorn giving a large donation to her former church, a donation that seemed to dry up after a few years. Vance now suspected there was more to that story, perhaps a coercive element, a quid pro quo that benefited Thorn more than the church. He realized now that the community was a complex web, where allegiances were often bought or enforced through fear. Some people, like the struggling shopkeepers who relied on Thorn's patronage, would undoubtedly remain loyal, fearing economic ruin if they spoke out. Others, like a few of the younger, more progressive members of his congregation, might rally to his side, seeing this as an opportunity for real change. He knew there would be resistance, whispers, and even outright hostility from those who benefited from the existing power structure or were too afraid to challenge it. The cultural dynamics of 1871 New Orleans amplified these complexities. The city was still scarred by the war, its social hierarchies rigid, its racial prejudices deeply ingrained. A wealthy white man like Thorn held immense sway, and challenging him was not just a social risk, but potentially a physical one. The pervasive fear of powerful figures was a tangible thing, a silent agreement that kept many from speaking truth to power. The psychological impact on Vance was profound. He felt the immense burden of this truth settle on his shoulders. It was no longer just about establishing a community center, it was about dismantling a system of injustice, about honoring Thomas's lost life and Marie's courage. He had to be strategic, careful, and unwavering. The responsibility weighed heavily, but it also ignited a fierce resolve. He knew this fight would be long and difficult, but he also knew deep in his heart that it was a fight he would not shy away from. He would find a way to expose Thorn, not just for Thomas, but for every voiceless soul in New Orleans. Vance began the arduous process of rebuilding, not just his own sense of purpose, but a path towards justice. He spent days in careful thought, strategizing how to use Marie's information. He wouldn't rush. This wasn't about revenge. It was about exposing a truth that had been buried for too long. He started by discreetly reaching out to a few trusted allies, people who shared his vision for a just New Orleans, but who also understood the delicate balance of power in the city. One such ally was a respected black lawyer, Mr. Arthur Jenkins, a man known for his sharp mind and unwavering commitment to civil rights. Vance presented the case to Jenkins, omitting Marie's name for her safety, but providing enough detail about Thomas's story and Thorn's manipulation to pique the lawyer's interest. Jenkins, after hearing the details, confirmed Vance's suspicions. While direct legal action against Thorn for a decades-old, unproven crime would be difficult, public exposure could be a powerful tool. They discussed the legal and public channels available, carefully navigating the complex social and legal landscape of the era. The goal was not necessarily to send Thorne to prison, but to strip him of his credibility and influence, to dismantle his carefully constructed facade. Their strategy involved gathering more corroborating evidence, speaking to former employees of Thorne's, and subtly encouraging others who had been wronged to come forward. It was a slow, painstaking process. Vance used his sermons not to directly accuse Thorne, but to speak about the insidious nature of injustice, the importance of truth, and the moral obligation to protect the vulnerable. He spoke in parables that, to those in the know, clearly pointed to Thorne's character. The whispers started. People began to connect the dots. The consequences for Thorne materialized gradually but surely. A prominent newspaper, known for its investigative journalism and not afraid to challenge powerful figures, picked up on the rumors and started its own investigation, subtly guided by Jenkins. They published a series of articles detailing Thorne's questionable business practices, his history of exploiting workers, and the stark contrast between his public persona and his private dealings. While no single article directly accused him of Thomas's murder, the cumulative effect was devastating. Public opinion began to turn. Thorne's benefactors started to distance themselves. His business dealings, once impenetrable, began to falter as fear of association grew. He lost several lucrative contracts and his social invitations dwindled. His public downfall was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, agonizing erosion of his power and influence. He wasn't ruined financially, but his reputation, his most valuable asset in that society, was in tatters. Justice in this context was served through public exposure and a societal reckoning, a moral reckoning that stripped him of the very thing he valued most, his standing. With Thorne's influence diminished, Vance found renewed support for his community center. The donations, once scarce, began to flow in. People who had been afraid to contribute now openly offered their help. The center became a beacon of hope, a tangible symbol of perseverance and community strength. It provided education, food, and medical assistance to those who needed it most, especially the recently freed enslaved population. Vance often stood on the porch of the bustling community center, watching the children play, the adults learn, and the community thrive. He reflected on his journey, the unexpected allies he found in people like Marie and Mr. Jenkins, and the profound lesson he had learned. Truth, even when buried deep beneath layers of power and deceit, eventually finds its way to the surface. He understood now that his faith wasn't just about sermons and prayer, it was about action, about standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. His work was far from over, but a sense of peace settled within him. He had faced injustice, and with courage and conviction, he had helped light a path towards a better, more just world. The enduring power of faith and perseverance he knew was the true strength of humanity.